Families separated through Child Protective Services voiced their anger on the steps of the state capitol today.
They say the system has a history of racial discrimination.
The CPS system is just a part of a bigger system. We have to destroy the whole damn thing.
53% of Black children will be investigated by the child welfare system by the time they turn 18.
The family policing system forcibly separates over 200,000 children from their families every year. Can a system that began with racist intent ever become a system that makes all children and communities safe?
We know the answer is no. Absolutely not.
Welcome to the Up In Podcast, a podcast that looks toward the abolition of the child welfare system, which we at Up In more accurately call the family policing system.
In this podcast, we contemplate the history of family separations in the U.S., the current state of the family policing system, and what a future without family policing can look like.
We're your hosts. I'm Josie Pickens.
And I'm Jason Oliver. Let's get started. Welcome back to the Up In Podcast. Before we introduce our guest, I want to introduce our guest host today. Sydney Mares is stepping in for Josie today. She is Up In's communications manager and our podcast producer. Welcome to the mic in the front of the show, Sydney.
I know, thank you. I'm usually behind the scenes, so I'm really excited to be here today. We've been researching and prepping for this episode for a long time because we just felt it was really important to get an Indigenous perspective on our season. We've been talking about solidarity all season, and we're really excited that we connected with the Warrior Women team to make this happen. So some background about why we wanted to do this episode is because family separations have been used as a colonization and genocidal tactic since before the founding of America, and these practices continue today. Native children are currently removed from their homes at 2 to 3 times the rate of white children and are often taken away from their relatives and their communities, even when those placements are available. So in this episode, we'll talk about some really difficult topics. We'll talk about the legacy of boarding schools, but we'll also, I think, get to some really hopeful topics, which are what Indigenous organizers are doing to preserve their culture and support their communities.
So we have a guest today, and Marcella Gilbert is a member of the Oceti Sakowin-7 Council Fires, known as the Great Sioux Nation, currently living on the Cheyenne River Indian reservation in north central South Dakota. Marcella is involved with the Standing Strong Grandmothers Group, whose main focus is to create local action in regards to child rescue efforts. Marcella is a lifelong member and student of the American Indian movement and We Will Remember Survival Group, a water protector, wife, and grandmother. Marcella also holds a master's degree in nutrition. Thank you for being with us today, Marcella.
Thank you. That was a great introduction.
So can you tell us about your story and your family history? How you came into this work?
Sure. I'll try to keep it short. But as in the introduction, I was raised in the American Indian movement because my family played a very heavy role in the movement. My mother is Madonna Thunderhawk, and she's been at almost every major action, like from Alcatraz Island to Standing Rock. And her brother, my uncle, is Russell Means. So I was pretty much, I'm part of the family. And so that was my upbringing is, learning about who I am as an Indian person living in the United States. And so I grew up with that. And then as a teenager, I was a student at We Will Remember Survival Group, a survival school that my mother started in Rapid City, South Dakota. And I was 13 when that happened. And when you're a teenager and you're learning about who you are, it's very empowering. And knowing, as a teenager, a young Indian person, learning that my relationship with this U.S. government is different than anybody else's in this country. that gives you power. It gave me that, I'm special. I'm someone. And as a young person, to have that information and to learn about that and learn about not just the ancient history, but the recent history of the relationship that our people have had or forced into with this United States government, that stuff you never forget. But it's also very empowering as a young person to learn all that, because then you know where your place is and you know who you are. And so it's stuff that you can't unlearn. And it's a realization that this is who I am and this is who my people are. And therefore I have responsibility. And so that carried all the way through into my adulthood. And so everything that I did from a place of confidence and power. Like, I was here first. No one else can say that. I can say that. I was here first, standing on this ground right here. And so that gives me a right to be the best person I can be. So I took that with me throughout my, through college and anything else that I was involved in or have been involved in. I come from that place where, that what I was taught as a young person. And being a part of the survival group was an experience that I will never give up. I mean, I'm so glad that happened because it's never happened again. There's never been a survival group like that, an educational environment like that. It was one of the first alternative education environments in the state of South Dakota because of the racism and the intolerance and the profiling. Of course, back then, profiling wasn't a word, but now we know what it was. It was profiling. And so Indian kids were being criminalized and profiled and pushed out of school and, all of that. And then to find a space where it's just for us and it's all us, all Indian kids. Because in South Dakota, it's still cowboys and Indians, so to find that place where it was safe for us and to learn about who we are and where we come from and what our future could possibly be. I would never give that up. And I wish we could do that again, because the educational system continues to fail in Indian country. So I've taken that throughout my life. I got a master's degree in nutrition because I've always been interested in health and nutrition. So, and when I had the opportunity to go, I was asked, what do you want to learn? What do you want to focus on? And I said, well, I want to learn what my people, the, Indian people, what our foods were and what their nutritional value. I mean, I know what they are, but what's their nutritional value? And the professors that I were talking to, they're saying, well, you would be the expert on that because we don't, they weren't set up at this university. They weren't set up in any way to teach me that, to give me more of that. So I had to do my study I studied the local Hutterite communities that are in South Dakota. But nutrition has always been my thing, so it was really interesting to me. And I've done a lot of research myself on the nutritional value of our foods and then relating it to our current diets and our current health and all that. So
I love that. Like, one, you talk about the importance of this cultural heritage and that being such an important part of your background and upbringing, but then also thinking about food and the ways that connects you with both people and the land, right? Like, you can't talk about and focus on food without either of those being an integral part of that conversation. So I love
absolutely
that food loops all of that together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then learning about the history. I mean, it's so amazing. It's just another part of our history that isn't talked about. No one talks about how Indigenous people of this land had forced diets. And you look at our, forced diet changes and you look at the state of health in Indian country and we're not doing well. And it's because of that, that we're not allowed to hunt like we used to. We can, like right now it's hunting season. It's going to be over in a few weeks. But what do we do when it's not hunting season? I mean, it's like,
We
the
still need to eat,
process of,
right?
yeah, the process of colonization and all that, it's definitely taken a toll on our health. And so, and that's one of the major ways, is our food. We don't have access to our original foods. So
I also wanted to ask about how this history of colonization and like the legacy of boarding schools. I mean, you talk about it disconnecting from your food, and at Upend, we're focused on abolishing the family policing system, or what we call, more commonly is known as the child welfare system. I was wondering if you could talk about how that colonization and the forced assimilation separated your people from their culture, but also their families, and what is the impact that we're still seeing today?
So this, as you mentioned earlier, this has been going on since the invasion of our lands. And, people, we have to sometimes give people perspective, like, okay, we're talking about trafficking here. If you know the story of Pocahontas, then that's what we're talking about. They came over here and screwed around with her people, stole her, but of course, in history, they say that she wanted to go and all that stuff. They stole her and took her to Europe. That's trafficking. She died over there without family. And they make it sound like, oh, she wanted to be white. She wanted to be this, and so anyway, that story has continued throughout the practice of invasion and genocide and theft and murder and everything else that goes along with it. But the taking of children, not only for purposes of destroying a people, but for the sick thinking of sick men who take children and use them for their personal devious desires.
Mm.
And that kind of thing was unheard of in our communities. Children were considered sacred. And so when you do that, you destroy a whole family when you take their children. And because we weren't considered human and we were criminalized for being alive and owning land, having land, not owning it, but being on a piece of land that they wanted, we were criminalized for being there. So we were never looked at as part of the human family. And so when you dehumanize people in that way, then it's okay, it justifies the mistreatment. And so even before boarding schools happened, there was so much death and destruction and so much, genocide happening. And then by the time the Europeans got to our lands in the middle of the United States, they were going through all their own hardships too. They were fighting each other and stealing slaves and, they were doing all kinds of stuff. But by the time they got to our country, they came thinking they were going to just keep moving and destroying and taking and all that. But when they got to our part of the country, they couldn't beat us. Their military couldn't beat us because our tactics were different. And so we were kicking butt. And that's why we have treaties, not because we wanted them, because they wanted, and they're all considered peace treaties because they couldn't beat us. Our military was better than theirs, and we were wiping them out. And so that's why we have the treaties. And in those treaties, even though there was a language barrier, we couldn't speak each other's languages, but our ancestors made sure that in some way our people were going to be taken care of in some way. And so we got some of the treaty obligations, access to some of our lands and hunting grounds and things like that. But a part of that was schools for our people. And if they weren't going to be able to wipe us out militarily, they had to figure out a different way to do it. And they found that taking children was one of the best ways to do it because it destroys the family immediately. And when you do history about what happened to our people when our children were taken, it didn't just devastate the mother. The men had nothing to fight for. It was so heartbreaking for them that they, there's stories of them going into battle with the intent to die because they didn't have their children. And of course, the mothers were, it was just such a devastating situation. But the invaders picked up on that. They're like, so this is how you do it. You take their kids and you got to take away their beliefs, because no matter what they did to us, we still had our belief systems. We still knew who we were. We had our connections to the land. We had our language, all that. Even though they took away our food, we still had our language and our spirituality. But they wanted that too. And so that's through the boarding school system, by taking our children. And it wasn't so much about destroying families as it was to destroy the native heart and mind and language. And so that's what they did. And it was military governmental policy to have all the children taken. And they were taken. They didn't come and say, here, sign up. They said, no, we're coming and we're taking your kids. And so that trauma of having your children torn from your arms has lasted. It's an undying trauma. And so that's one of the effects. So, we don't trust white people. So the boarding school system has definitely created a Indian person that has no place, because they're not white enough to be respected among the white people. But in Indian country, they don't know their language anymore. They don't know those ceremonies anymore. They don't know how to, because they were raised in an environment where there's no mother or father, no one to care for them, no one to care, like to love them and to teach them and to, tell them it's going to be okay. There was none of that. So you take a young person, raise them like that, and then send them back to their people. They don't know where they belong. And the people are like, okay, what? Who are you now? Okay, we recognize you. You're my relative. Come and stay with me. But this person doesn't know they've forgotten the language. They don't know their role in our societies anymore. And those things were taught at a very young age. I mean, our girls, when they went through their womanhood ceremonies, they were taught to be mothers and to take care of a family and to take care of a home. In the same way with the young boys, when they went through their manhood ceremonies, they were taught how to provide for their family. And there's a lot involved with that. A lot, because it's connected spiritually, it's connected to the land, it's connected to your relatives, and so going to boarding school, I think my generation was the last generation that had the churches control the boarding schools. And so when I went, there was a fence in the playground, there's a fence that went, right down the middle of the playground, and the boys were on one side and the girls were on the other. And me and my brothers would stand at the fence and visit, and they would come and they would hit our hands if we touched the fence. So we weren't allowed to even communicate with our siblings. And among our people, the brother-sister relationship is the most important. Aside from the mother, it's the brother and sister, because that's the relationship where you learn how to treat each other, where you learn how to get along. And the sister always takes care of the brother. If whatever he needs that a woman needs to provide, like, if he needed new moccasins, or, he needed new clothes or whatever. And that carries on today. We still have families, you could tell, it used to be a competition, and it wasn't a competition where it wasn't like an outward competition. It was more of like, that man over there, when he's dressed up really well, that his sisters are taking care of him. Mm-hmm. When he's looking really good, it's not because of him, it's because of his sisters. And so that relationship was cut off in boarding school. We weren't allowed to be around each other. And when I was in boarding school, we weren't even allowed to talk to each other. So you imagine being in boarding school for however many years, and it's heartbreak every time there's a situation where it could be hopeful, I'm gonna get to see my brother today, but then I can't talk to him. So it's a constant heartbreak situation, and so
Mm-hmm.
it's not only affected families, it's affected our hearts and our spirituality and our self-esteem. Who am I? Who am I? If I grew up in boarding school, who am I? Am I a product of the church? But the church doesn't love me like my family did. They beat me. They did things to me that my family would never have done. So who am I if, what was the result of spending time in these boarding schools? And so what we experience, and this is trauma that continues to be passed on. We don't know how to parent. We have to relearn how to parent. We have to relearn how to love ourselves so that we can love our children and those around us. We don't know how to be in relationships. We have to learn how to be in relationships. And so, it's affected every aspect of being a loving, caring human being because the boarding schools were opposite that. We weren't considered human, so we weren't allowed to be loved or cared for. And so the boarding schools don't exist anymore other than to, not like they did back in the 60s. Like I said, I think my generation was the last generation that experienced those horrific, violent schools.
Mm-hmm.
And there's still boarding schools now, but they're not like that. There's schools where kids go to live, to go to school, and they're taken care of. They're not anywhere near that. So we have communities that struggle with all kinds of, poverty for one thing, because our reservations are not allowed to thrive. We have to be subjects. We're considered subjects of the government. So they decide. And so there's a lot of poverty on, at least on our reservation, upwards of 70-80% unemployment. There's 60% people who are dependent on the handouts, so, and then we're isolated. We're in a part of South Dakota that doesn't really, there's not much there. It's cattle country. So if you're not a rancher, so the poverty is there. And then you add to that all these abuses that you learned at boarding school. They tend to be perpetuated among your own people. So it's definitely, I believe that if the intention was to destroy us, it worked, because we struggle with every single health issue. We struggle, like I said, unemployment. We don't know how to get along. We have to relearn how to be a human being that's able to have healthy relationships. And many of us are, I'm not saying that 100% of us are screwed up, because a lot of us are helping ourselves and figuring this out and moving in directions that improve our family situation. It's not everybody, but it's enough that has a detrimental effect on our future.
So I'm wondering, Marcella, now that we've gotten some of that context on boarding schools and the ways that they're still influencing Indigenous and Native families, like how are Indigenous communities organizing to keep families together? What does that work look like?
So most of that is happening through different organizations that have formed in Indian country. Like, we're reclaiming a lot of our societies. And the womanhood and manhood ceremonies, those have come back in the last 20 years really strong. And that has really helped our young people, the ones who go through it, because that's where they're finding their identity. They're finding out that they are special. This is a special time of your life. And these are the skills that you should have. And this, so that's really helpful. And the women who are organizing those have also organized societies of women that their focus is to teach young families. And it's usually the young women, give them skills. Let's relearn how do you dry meat? What are the wild foods that we can harvest, and when and where, and what do you do with them, and how do they taste, and how do you cook them, and all that. So the societies are coming back slowly and offering these kinds of opportunities for young people to be prepared. And then there's, we have a large population of people who are involved in academics, and, they come back and they help, because almost every reservation has a tribal college. So our tribal colleges, take time to really focus on the treaties and focus on the history and focus on the effects of genocide and colonization, and, give our people an understanding of why it's the way it is. We don't choose to live in poverty. We don't choose to, not get along with each other. This is why, and it's interesting because when I did my research and, and I continued to do research on nutrition, but it was interesting to me to learn that when our people were in concentration camps and we weren't allowed to have access to our own food, they took away all our weapons, so we couldn't go hunting. We were in concentration camps, so we couldn't go harvest foods. And they gave us strange food like flour and sugar and pig fat and, stuff that we had no, pigs aren't even from here. And so it was strange and we didn't know what to do with it. But that was the time that we learned how to make fry bread. Because our people were not bread eaters. Wheat is not even from this country. And so, and we were mobile. Our people, the Great Sioux Nation, we were not agrarian tribe. We traveled. We followed the buffalo. So we were always on the move. And so we didn't do a lot of planting. And so, learning that's when we first learned how to use a frying pan, was in those concentration camps. That's the first time, that's where fry bread came from, because we didn't know what, someone taught us how to use flour and sugar and oil and, all that. So that was a result of that. And when I talked to elderly people, and this was, 20 years ago, the elders then, they were like, well, some of them they revered fry bread because it kept our people alive. Because our people, many, many, many people died from starvation, because our people had a spiritual belief with our food, and we believed that you didn't eat certain foods. You didn't eat animals that were stink. And of course, we didn't eat foods that we had no idea what it was. So some of our people, they were just like, okay, this is it. I'm out. I'll just starve to death. And so they did. And then others, of course, the little ones and the elderly, they had no choice. It wasn't a choice for them. They just ended up starving because there wasn't enough food. So, that kind of history, learning of how this whole colonization affected every aspect of our lives. And so that's a lot of reclamation that we're working on now. And all that's coming back. I mean, our herbalists are back. There's a large number of women who are taking on bringing back the value of plants and how to use them to heal. So it's exciting that way, because we're getting to that point.
Yeah, I like that. And one thing that you had mentioned, you had brought up conflict, like conflict within the community, especially as people are learning to be back in relationship and in community with one another after, going through so much over generations, right? Like being stripped of your culture and the ways of being together. So I'm interested in community accountability. One thing that we talk about at Upend is just our obsession as a culture with punishment as opposed to accountability. So I'm curious about the grandmothers group that you're involved in, and then ways that you all are really centering community accountability and support as opposed to separation and punishment as ways to deal with conflict.
Yeah, so I think the way that we're looking at this is because we know our history and we lived through it. Many of our grandmothers in our group are elderly. They're in their late 70s and 80s. And our group is called Washagya Naji. And that's the Lakota for standing strong. and it refers to the strength of the heart that can move you to stand strong for whatever. So one of the ways, well, there's a couple ways, but we try not to focus on all the crap. Like, let's not focus on why you're doing such a bad job or it looks like that. Let's focus on who we are and what we can do to help this situation. And so the parts that we focus on are our spirituality, getting that back, getting people back into looking at that, because there's so much that it offers, especially when you're in ceremony, and it's just such a, renewing, you feel renewed when you come out of ceremony, because everything makes sense. No matter how screwed up the world is, on a spiritual level, it makes sense. That what's happening here is temporary. We need to not get so crazy about it. So that helps, getting people to that place where they find hope. And then our traditional kinship ties. Like everybody in Indian country knows how important grandmothers are. And so we focus on, remind them of their spirituality, no matter what it is. Because of the colonization of our people on our reservation, greater than 60% are Christian. And so we encourage them, go pray. Whatever it is you do, go do that. And, do it whenever you need to. But we also focus on our kinship ties, because the grandmother, what the grandmother means among our people is still the number, people respect your grandma no matter what. They listen to your grandma no matter what, that kind of thing. And so we encourage not only learning about your, who's the important person in your life, and then bringing them in, and helping them to, anyway, just working together, bringing as many people as we can to help this person who within their family, because we don't want to do things for them, because then that's not helpful. But if we help them to help themselves, then they can stand strong on a path. They know where they're going, and they know that they have help getting there. And just, encouraging people, don't be afraid to acknowledge that you don't know how to be a mom or you don't know how to be a dad. Let's talk about it. There's places, let's talk about it. What, because some people are like, well, I don't know how, and I'm not good at it, so I'm not going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And we're like, well, you should have thought of that before you had kids. But the kids are here now, so let's figure out how we can, what's the best way to do this.
Yeah.
And because we still, the grandmothers are really strong because of the effects of the boarding school. We're losing a generation, and that generation is still having kids, but they're not taking care of them. That's why there's so many grandparents who are raising children now. And I think it's all over, not just in Indian country. But so, we're looking at finding those societies and finding those groups and programs that support us in creating opportunity for young people and focusing on young people, so that, if they already had kids, let's help this young family out. Because there are families, I've seen many in our community on the reservation, young families, and they want to be a family. But because of poverty, there's no housing, there's no jobs, there, no childcare, there, so right away they're thrust into hardship. And so we try to provide support and advocate for them to any of the programs that are going on, any of the societies that work with young people, because they're, like I said, the societies are becoming very important, because they're the ones for the girls. There's a lot, because the women are really getting organized around it. And the ones for the men we have to support, because they're struggling a little bit to get it together, but they're coming back. And that's the important thing is, we're encouraging them to go to those ceremonies. If you don't be afraid to go, go, because that belongs to you. But it's work, because it's not an easy thing. We got families who just are, the addiction situation can be really, really bad. And every parent wants to be a parent, but if they can't get over the addiction, it becomes a hard realization that, okay, these kids are not going to have their parents. So what do we do? And so building and working with our tribal council, and my mother has been involved in this for 20 some years now, maybe 30 years now, bringing the attention to what's happening in Indian country with Indian children, and specifically in the state of South Dakota, because it is trafficking. You look at it and it's kidnap and traffic, because you hear the stories. We hear the stories of how parents and grandparents are getting the children are being taken. And what's happening with those who are struggling with addiction, they end up in jail. And if a girl is pregnant and she's in jail and has her baby in jail, that baby literally disappears. We can't find those kids. Mm-hmm. We don't know what happened to them. So immediately the young mother is, because she has an addiction problem or whatever it is, she's not considered human anymore. So we're back to that again. Yeah. And my question is, when have we ever been considered human? And so we've been struggling with that since the invasion, because that mentality has not changed.
I had a thought while you were talking about the grandmothers. I was wondering, it's such a different mindset from the white supremacist, two-parent, two-kid nuclear family, to think about family as being much broader than that, being even your grandmother that's not your grandmother, right? Or your aunt that's not your aunt. So I guess my question was, how do you imagine if you could reorganize the world so that no kids are taken from child welfare and adopted out or trafficked, as you say, it's kind of more accurate to say that, right? How would you rearrange the world in your community to imagine what it would be like for kids to be supported by the whole community? What would that look like for you? What would they need?
So one of the things that the grandmothers group did is we worked with a nonprofit out of Connecticut back in 2018. And as a result of our collaboration, they built a children's village. And that was specifically to offer foster care for Indian kids from that reservation. And right now the tribe has purchased that village, and it's closed, but they're going to reopen soon. But I've learned many things, because I was the director of that village for a year. And one of the things that I know absolutely what our communities and all communities in Indian country needs is support services related to counseling. I think that every school, high school, college in Indian country, there should be a counselor or 2 or 3 available, because the trauma that our people experience it's like it's in our DNA. It's perpetuated over the generations because it's so, it's just really hard. So I think having counselors for everybody and their dog, having an adequate law enforcement agency, an adequate court system, because our children's court is lacking, our civil court is lacking. So families aren't being supported. It's more about punishment than it is about helping and improving situations for young families. And I think those things need to happen in Indian country so that we can heal enough to see beyond our trauma and help each other move forward. And the grandmothers provide that. No matter where you go, there's a group of grandmothers doing what they need to do or what they want to do. But we also need resources to help grandmothers who are raising grandchildren. Because in our community, on our reservation, we have, just within our grandmothers group, there's about 12 of us who are involved. And out of those 12, 8 of us are taking care of 32 kids.
Wow.
That's a lot. I mean, we have a grandmother who had 12 grandchildren in her home because she didn't want them in the foster care system. Because the foster care system does not validate grandparents. They ignore the Indian Child Welfare Act. They violate it regularly. They don't even consider it to be an official act. So the state of South Dakota perpetuates the violence and the kidnapping and the child trafficking of Indian country because the state of South Dakota gets money from the federal government for, every child that is in foster care, no matter if it's white or Indian, the state will get money. And if those kids have any kind of mental health issues, they get more money. And so what happens in South Dakota is they take a child from a family, they get them in their system, boom, right away they get some money from the feds. But if that child has mental health issues, they'll get more. So what they do is they label all our Indian kids as special needs. And they validate that by saying, well, these kids always run away. And they do. It's common for Indian kids. They run away every chance they get. And so that's considered a mental health issue. That's considered a special needs child. So then the government gives them more money. So the state of South Dakota that's how they fund their state. Not just through that, but that's one of the ways that South Dakota funds their state is by child trafficking, Native kids. And so it's an issue that isn't easily, it takes a lot of work to be a group of grandmothers who are trying to take on the state of South Dakota because we don't have funding, we don't have the resources that the state has, and they have the backing of the U.S. government. So it's huge. It's a big issue. And so, we could use some really good lawyers who are committed to taking on the issue of child trafficking. We need some really good counselors to help us keep up the fight and to counsel the young people who are experiencing trauma, because the state will come in and they literally when I say kidnap, it's real. They usually come to the reservations or any Indian population in whatever city, and they find out what school this kid is going to, and they take them from school, and the child and parents never see each other until they're in court, if the parent is notified of the court date in time. And all of this is documented. The Lakota People's Law Project did a huge spotlight on this whole issue in South Dakota back in 2013, and I think it lasted through 17 or something, but all this is documented, how this is happening in South Dakota.
Yeah.
And so those are the resources we need in Indian country to save our kids. We need, the healing part. We need the adequate structural, like I said, the law enforcement and the court system. And of course, not living in poverty would be nice, to actually have a home to live in so you can take care of your kids, and a job so you can take care of your home, that kind of thing. So
I want to ask and take a moment. When you say law enforcement, what are you thinking about there? Like, what do you envision? Because I'm thinking about the movie Warrior Women and talking about like the relationship with law enforcement definitely came up in that as well, right? So when you say law enforcement, what are you imagining?
We need more officers on the ground, but we also need training related to trauma that families experience related to domestic violence or addiction or whatever it may be, and focus on the kids. Like, you don't just take them away from the family because something's happening, and the grandmother's group is like, don't take the child, take the whole family. The whole family needs to go into treatment. The whole family needs counseling. The whole family needs a safe place to be until they can get some healing and figure out how they're going to be a family. Because right now it's just take the kids, and they take the child because they think they're providing safety for the child. And I'm sure they are, but when you tear a child from their family, that's just more trauma. So when I say law enforcement, I mean, having more police officers on the ground, but also more training that's directed and focused on what's happening in that community.
And are you seeing them be helpful now? Like, I'm wondering about what your experiences are with police officers. Because when they say law enforcement, they might mean alternative responders, right? That are coming in and trying to help people work through crises that they're experiencing, because they find that the traditional police officers might escalate issues as opposed to like helping to solve them. So I'm curious about how you're seeing police support the well-being and safety of Indian and Native communities. Yeah, how that's looking from your vantage point.
That's one of the things that the grandmothers group is trying to get the tribe to rejuvenate, is to reinstate the child welfare task force. And that's what they would do when a child was in crisis. The police officer would call the task force, and they would step in and provide some support to the child and the family. So that's one of the things that we're working on. But the thing too, in Indian country, especially in our reservation, because we're pretty isolated out there, the police officers we're all related to each other. They know each other. My uncle was the police chief. My cousin's husband was a police. It's like that. So it's a small enough community that the police officers know everybody, and we're all related in some way. And so, there's expectations that are put on the police officers as well. If you know that your cousin's kids are in trouble, then the grandmothers step in and they're like, well, these are your relatives, let's think about this and let's do what's right here, that kind of thing. But it's a tough situation because we have all the problems that exist with poverty. So those are the areas that I think we need support. Of course, there's many more, we need housing, we need jobs, we need better schools, we need, all that. But in order to keep our families together, we need some serious counseling services and facilities where people can go. And that's our big push, is like, okay, you bought this children's village, then let's implement a family restoration. When a child is in crisis, that means the family is in crisis. So take all of them and put them in this house over here, and they get all the resources they need to heal. So that's what we're pushing for. And it's a long, I've been involved in this for 4 years now, and it's very slow process because there's not enough resources.
Just now, you heard a conversation about policing that may sound unusual to our listeners. At Upend, we believe that abolishing policing in all carceral systems, rather than reforming them, is the only way to make our families and communities safe. We also believe in telling full and authentic stories and making space for guests to share their thoughts and ideas about how to address the problems in their communities. After all, the purpose of this podcast is to learn together in community. To learn more about evaluating reforms versus abolitionist steps to end the family policing system, visit upandmovement.org/framework.
I wanted to ask also about the film Warrior Woman. If y'all have not seen it, we'll put a link to where you can watch it in the episode notes. But Jason and I were able to watch the film, and I feel like I learned so much. And it's kind of one of those things where when you learn about something, you realize how much you don't know, and then you want to learn more. So I was wondering, What stories are you seeking to preserve and share through the film and your oral history efforts with the Warrior Women Project?
I think with the film, the first thing I think about is how important women are in our cultures. The film is, it highlights a part of our history that is unknown because, the media, and it says it in the film, my mom talks about it in the film, because the media is focused on men, the women were left out of the history and out of the stories of our fight to be who we are. So, and most importantly, when Elizabeth approached, when she was like, hey, let's do a film, and my mom was like, no, we're not doing the Madonna Thunderhawk show. I'm not doing it, and Beth was like, well, she's telling her to this, and this, because she had all those interviews of women over 20 years, and she continues to do that. I mean, that's part of the Oral History Project, is continue to get those stories. But my mom said, okay, I will do this, but it's not going to be a film where, it's got 15 minutes of fame and then it sits on a shelf somewhere. She said, I want this to be in the educational system. This is history, and it needs to be in universities and schools across this country, because this is our history on this land with this government. This is history of this country. And so that's what she wanted, that it become part of the academia, where it's part of the history of this country, because it is.
I hope people are watching it as we did. I mean, I've been recommending it to everybody that I know.
Awesome. We're trying to get it into as many schools as we can.
Yeah, one of the moments from the film that struck us, especially as we're thinking about solidarity this season, is how Black power movements were deeply connected to Indigenous resistance. What have Indigenous movements learned from other movements, and then what can perhaps the abolition movement learn from Indigenous resistance?
Wow, that's a really good question. I mean, it's so important that we support each other. I mean, I remember when I was in survival group, my mom was like, okay, this is what's happening and this is what you're going to learn. And we had to all research one person from the Black Panthers. But it made me real, hearing how, and this is just listening to my mom, talking, but she thought, that the Black Panthers were the group to look towards because of all the things that they accomplished, because of the work that they did. They were feeding children in their communities, and that was unheard of before then. And because of what they did, now children everywhere have meals. It's like all the work and all the intelligence. That's the thing that I really connected with, was when she would talk about them and how smart the Black Panthers and the Black Power movement, how smart they were in moving forward and standing unafraid, and making that example of being powerful in your skin. And I think that was really encouraging it was for her, and it was for me, when she was telling us, teaching us, this is what you need to know. This is what's happening. It's not just about us. It's everywhere. We have to learn, and we have to learn to support and learn from, because our stories are the same. We have the same colonizer and the same violence. So, and I think that, we're all, because we're in the same boat, it just makes sense that we continue to support each other as we move forward, and continue to share that sense of pride, and to stand unafraid. I mean, that's what's gotten us this far, is to not back down, and to have that courage to to stand and not be afraid, because truth always prevails.
I feel like that's such a good place. That was so hopeful. I feel like that's such a good place to wrap up our conversation because, yeah, that's one of the things we wanted to talk about this season and why we wanted to talk with you is because we're exploring how our freedoms and our liberation are connected with each other. And thank you for bringing that perspective.
Yeah. And so with that in mind, where can people connect with you and your work? How can people stay connected with you and the work that you're a part of?
The best place, it would be the Warrior Women Project, because right now, working with the Grandmothers Group, that group was started by my mother and several other women in our community. So the Warrior Women Project supports the grandmothers as best that we can. And so because we're connected so closely, Beth knows everything that we're doing every day and what's going on in our community. So,
and please give our thanks to Beth for helping make this happen also.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
She's really working hard.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you sharing your insights. We hope that you've enjoyed your time with us on the podcast, and we're excited for the conversations that will continue among our listeners who will get to hear this.
Yes, I mean,
awesome. Yes, thank you for having me, and I hope that your listeners will contact their local school or college and say, "Hey, you need to bring Warrior Women, and you need to bring the team."
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Let's do it. Y'all go click the link in the description. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for the Upend podcast as we explore family policing system abolition. To learn more about Upend and our work to strengthen families and communities, visit our website at upendmovement.org and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Upend Movement.